如何打，并赢得信息战。
How can one engage audiences that seem
Engage audiences.
这个词组的含义是与观众互动，吸引观众的注意力。
to be living in an alternative reality? How do
Living in an alternative reality.
这个口语俚语的含义是指人们似乎生活在一个与现实不同的世界里。
we reach people who seem smitten, besotted with the propaganda of sadistic strongmen?
Propaganda of sadistic strongmen.
这个口语俚语的含义是指那些残忍强权的宣传。
That's the sort of happy stuff that I work on, that I write books about, that I research at university, and that is
Become very, very personal.
这个短语的含义是指某些事情变得非常私人化、个人化。
has become very, very personal for me in the last couple of years. I was born in Ukraine, and since the full-scale invasion began, I've been going to Ukraine a lot to work with an NGO called the Reckoning Project to document war crimes and to tell the truth about them to
tell the truth about them.
这个短语的意思是要说出真相，通常用于表示要揭露或披露某些秘密或不公平的事实。
an often skeptical world.
An often skeptical world.
这个短语的意思是指一个常常怀疑或不信任某些事物的人群或社会。
I'm afraid there's a lot of atrocities that we document. I was in the
Atrocities.
这个名词的意思是指残酷、令人发指或极其恶劣的事物或行为。
town of Bucha, when it was liberated from Russian forces, entered the village to see hundreds of bodies strewn around, being placed in a mass grave. And these people were killed not because, a missile landed on them by accident. They were just shot for fun by Russian soldiers, just to prove they had the power over them. There was no military sense to this atrocity. And I remember talking to a Ukrainian general as we watched these dead bodies being piled in to a grave, and he was in shock. He'd liberated the village. But he was also in shock because he'd actually spent a lot of time in Russia itself. He'd actually studied to be a soldier there. He had lots of former students that he'd studied with there, former colleagues. And ever since the war had begun, he'd been calling them, saying, please do something to stop this horrific war. And they just throw the phones down. And so many Ukrainians were calling their Russian relatives, their, now former friends, and saying, please do something to stop this war. At least don't stop your sons from going to fight in this war. And at the other end, they'd hear people who they'd known all their lives answering in the cliches of Russian propaganda, saying, you're making it up. You've made some...
Make it up.
这个知识点的含义是指捏造或编造事实。惯用法是在口语中使用时，常常与否定词连用，如 you're making it up 或 it's all fake, you're making it all up。这个 idiom 源自于19世纪的美国西部牛仔文化，后来被广泛应用在英语口语中。
sort of mistake, or saying, probably your side just bombed itself by accident, or saying, it's all fake, you're making it all up. And on Russian TV at the time, you'd hear these increasingly absurd, propaganda pieces about atrocities like Bucha. I'll give you one.
Atrocities.
这个知识点的含义是指残酷、令人发指的行为，类似于我们常说的暴行。
One example. After the atrocities of Bucha were discovered to the world, mainstream Russian TV, 7 p.m., this is not some sort of kooky YouTube channel, mainstream Russian TV.
Kooky YouTube channel.
这个知识点的含义是指一种不靠谱、不专业的东西，类似于我们常说的水果篮子。
TV was claiming that the British secret services had engineered a fake atrocity in Bucha. The whole thing
Engineered.
这个知识点的含义是指设计、策划，类似于我们常说的操纵。
was staged. And you know,
Stage the whole thing.
这个知识点的含义是指策划、操纵整个事件，类似于我们常说的捣鬼。
why and how they knew it was staged by the British? Because the
Staged by the British.
这个知识点的含义是指英国人故意制造或操纵某个事件。
place was called Butcher, which in
Bucha sounds like butcher.
这个知识点的含义是指 butcher 的发音与 butcher 相似。
English sounds like butcher, and only the English, this very literary people, would concoct an atrocity which in a place which sounded like the word butcher, and that was their
Concoct an atrocity.
这个知识点的含义是指故意制造或操纵某个恶劣事件。
proof. And people would, repeat this absurd propaganda.
Repeat this absurd propaganda.
这个知识点的含义是指重复某种荒谬的宣传。
Look, Russia is an extreme, a horrific example of people not wanting to live in reality, but
People not wanting to live in reality.
这个知识点的含义是指某些人不愿面对现实。
I've been living in the US a couple of years and I see quite a lot of it here. Tens of millions, maybe more people who seem to genuinely believe that the last election was rigged, despite sort of court cases proving that it wasn't. So what can we do about it? I'm in a community of researchers, of academics, of journalists who've been trying many things for the last sort of decade, really. We've tried fact-checking, but we've also found that, when facts challenge people's identity, they kind of just bounce off. We've tried worthy journalism, these great liberal newspapers lecturing people about how important it is to save democracy. I've written many columns like that myself. But I know that I'm preaching to the converted. I know that I'm
Preaching to the converted.
这个知识点的含义是指在已经同意或支持某个观点的人面前讲述同样的话题，毫无新意。这种情况下，听众并不会对所传达的信息产生新的认识或改变态度。
within my own, liberal echo chamber, basically. How do we get beyond that? How can we reach the people who are somehow under the sway of this propaganda? And in a kind of despair, I started to turn to history. Might there be something in history that gives us a clue about what we can do today? And that's how I discovered a very strange and somewhat forgotten story about a covert British operation to subvert Nazi propaganda, perhaps the most or one of the most reality-denying, sadistic, dehumanizing propagandas ever, Nazi propaganda. And it was led by this man. His name was Sefton Delmer. A largely forgotten person, but very, very famous in his day. Sefton Delmer kind of shared a lot of the frustrations that I have. He felt that, at the start of the Second World War, liberal media, in his case, the German service of the BBC, or various kind of like exiled pro-democracy groups who were still trying to communicate with the German people, trying to persuade them not to follow Hitler into his genocidal wars, he felt that they were doing it all wrong. Yeah, they were lecturing people, a bit like we do today, about how democracy dies in darkness, how we must stop fascism. He felt all of that, just like a lot of media today, is trapped in its own echo chamber, preaching to the converted. He wants
Preaching to the converted.
这个词组的含义是指在说服已经同意的人身上浪费时间。它通常用于批评那些只对同一派别的人进行宣传或说教的人。
to do something different. And he knew what he was talking about. He'd grown up in Germany. He was British, but he grew up in Germany. He'd then been a journalist in the 1920s inside Germany. And he got very close to the Nazi elites when they were still rising. And he got to see their propaganda system from inside. And essentially, he could see that it was based on 2 or 3 principles which are really very common to strongman propaganda today. The first of these was identification with the leader. What do we mean by that? Look, we often wonder, why do people follow leaders who are wildly narcissistic, sadistic, cruel, violent? When people first saw Hitler appear, they thought he was, some kind of freak. And yet this freak had a huge following. And Delmer worked out that these leaders were popular because they allow their followers to be the narcissistic, sadistic, cruel people that at some level, many of them, and maybe many of us, would sometimes like to be. They were normalizing our most vile feelings. Yeah? Their very attractiveness was their nastiness. Secondly, he could see how people could sort of sublimate their agency through these.
Sort of sublimate their agency.
这个知识点的含义是指人们通过某种方式来转移或掩盖自己的权利和控制感。这种表达方式比较口语化，常见于日常对话中。
Leaders, these leaders could be their retribution. Yes, you're giving up a little bit of free will, but you could feel.
Giving up a little bit of free will.
这个知识点的含义是指放弃一些自由意志，变得更容易被控制或影响。
Feel powerful through the leader. And thirdly, this propaganda and these leaders created a sense of community. Germany in the 1920s, a little bit, like America today, was a place where the old economic order was being destroyed, where the old social norms were in chaos, where identities were in flux,
Identities were in flux.
这个词组的意思是身份在变化，可能指的是社会、政治或个人层面上的变化。
Gender norms were being questioned.
Being questioned.
这个短语的意思是被挑战或被质疑，可能指的是社会规范、价值观念等方面的变化。
And in this time of exciting for some people, for others very disturbing change, the Nazis said, "We know who you are. You're true Germans. You're better."
True Germans.
这个短语的意思是真正的德国人，可能指的是对德国身份认同的强调。
Germans than all these immigrants over here. You're the true people, and we're part of one community. The
Part of one community.
这个短语的意思是属于一个共同体，可能指的是对德国社会凝聚力的强调。
Nazi folk, the Nazi people.
Volk.
这个词的意思是德国人民，可能指的是对德国民族认同的强调。
We know who we are, and we're together. So Delmer realized that in order to subvert the connection between Nazi propaganda and its followers, you had to really climb into the dark operating of human desire, the place.
Climb into the dark operating of human desire.
这个知识点的含义是指进入人类欲望的深处，无法用事实来检查或证实。这种表达方式常见于口语中，特别是在讨论心理学、人性等方面。
Where fact-checking can't really go. And so, based at Woburn Abbey, a rather fabulous British country house near London, he gathered around himself psychiatrists, spies, soldiers, academics, a lot of exiled cabaret artists from the German theatre scene. He gathered them together and created this kind of covert media empire. Dozens of radio stations broadcasting into Nazi Germany and the rest of occupied Europe, newspapers, leaflets, this whole kind of factory of psychological subversion. Now, we don't have, sadly, the recordings of all these radio shows. However, we do have the transcripts. And when I realized these transcripts were available, I went, delicious. And I started going through them. I actually spent a lot of COVID going through them. And they've been declassified from the British and the American archives. And as I went through these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages, I realized there was kind of a pattern to them. They were experimenting like crazy. But there is, because this is a TED Talk, because always three with TED Talks, there's three basic principles that I think Delmer kind of landed on through experimentation. Number one, break the monopoly authoritarian propaganda has on strong emotions. Yeah, that's the
Break the monopoly authoritarian propaganda has on strong emotions.
这个知识点的含义是指挑战或打破某种强大的、专制的宣传机器对人们的情绪的控制。
root of their power.
That's the root of their power.
这个知识点的含义是指某种强大的力量或影响力的根源。
So Delmer's media, his radio stations, which were many and different, but they were all a lot unlike the BBC or the New York Times or the Washington Post. They were full of vitriol, anger, a lot of pornography.
Vitriol.
这个知识点的含义是指一种强烈的、带有恶意的批评或攻击性言论。
They were tapping into all the resentments that
Tapping into all the resentments.
这个知识点的含义是指利用人们对某事物的不满情绪。惯用法是指在口语中使用这种表达方式时，通常会将其作为一个整体来使用，而不是单独的使用每个词。
Germans were starting to feel about their leadership. They were full of these sort of like howls and laments about families that people were losing in the bombardment, and then blaming the Nazis for not having provided the right air defense. Yeah? They talk about how, the SS, the Nazi sort of elite secret police type units, how they were living, this corrupt life while normal German soldiers were suffering. Here's just a little clip from one of the shows. The SS wear the German uniform, but they drag the German name in the mud. They should
Drag the German name in the mud.
这个知识点的含义是指损害某人的名誉或声誉。惯用法是在口语中使用 mud 来表示不良行为或恶意。
send them to the Eastern Front. There, everything else but their penis would get stiff. There they would get an idea how hard the German soldier has to fight for his good name, while the SS clique does not give a shit about it. It was full of expletives as well. There were all these scenes. This is actually the most sort of like, un-X-rated bit of pornography I could find, which
Un-X-rated bit of pornography I could find.
这个知识点的含义是指一种不带成人内容的色情片段。惯用法是指在口语中使用这种短语来描述某种东西是不完整或不成熟的。
It's kind of like an orgy at an SS man's house. Like SS man Tienemann has a Polish lover at home who's personally in charge of the bamboo canes, twigs, thin and thick leather straps with which Tienemann and his guests are strafing her fat and large buttocks. And I had to cut it there because it goes on. So, there's a reason to this, yeah? He wants to disrupt the emotional bond that people have to the Nazis. He wants to cover the Nazis in what he
Cover the Nazis.
这个知识点的含义是指对抗或反对某种恶行或不公正的事物。
called a layer of filth and slime as thick
A layer of filth and slime.
这个知识点的含义是指一个肮脏、恶臭的地方。
as the Nazis had covered the Jews. But his aim, once he's disrupted that, once he's sort of taken strong emotions back, is to create a space where you can introduce facts to people. He gave people advice about how to fake illness so that they could be sent home from the front. So it wasn't just any facts. It's facts that gave people back their agency, made them
Agency.
这个知识点的含义是指个人或组织对自己生活和行动的控制权。
Facts that gave people back their agency.
这个知识点的含义是指通过提供事实信息来恢复个人或组织对自己生活和行动的控制权。
less dependent on their leaders. And thirdly, he fostered alternative communities. Yeah, if the
Fostered.
这个词组的含义是鼓励、支持某种事物的发展。 例如，他在公司里创造了一个积极的工作环境，鼓励员工创新和进取。
Nazis gave you a sense of identity, a common sense of being part of the people, the Volk. Delma's shows stressed the church, the army, family as these alternative bonds that people had. There's a very important thing in his shows. Basically, most of the shows he created would claim to be German shows. Yeah? They would say, "We Germans." Yeah? They would be hosted by soldiers who just become POWs with the British. But the audience was meant to understand perfectly well that these were the British, yeah, dressed up as Germans.
Dressed up as Germans.
这个知识点的含义是指将英国人装扮成德国人的样子，用于隐瞒真实身份。
Why did Delma do that? Firstly, it made it safe for people to listen to the shows. Yeah? If the Gestapo came along, you could say, "Well, I had no idea this was subversive. I thought this was German." It was psychologically safer. Yeah? It was more comfortable for people to hear the word "our soldiers," "our boys," than "you Germans," "you enemy." But even more so, he was saying something else. He was saying, "Look, we're the English dressed up as Germans, and we are
Dressed up as Germans.
这个知识点的含义是指英国人装扮成德国人的样子，表明他们理解和同情德国人的感受。
understand you, your gripes, your anger, what matters to you, better than the Nazis. And if we, your enemies, not in a culture war, but in a real war, can understand you better than your bosses, do you really need them? Are they really looking out for you when they say they're going to be your retribution? Or are they just thinking about themselves? 40% of German soldiers that were surveyed by the British in these little sort of snap polls they did said they listened to this content. So how can we bring that all back to today? Yeah. Whether we're thinking about reaching Russians, whether we're thinking about reaching audiences caught up in what some academics call the far-right echo chamber.
Caught up in what some academics call the far-right echo chamber?
这个知识点的含义是指被某些极右翼思想或观念所包围或影响。
If we take Delma's principles, they are much easier to activate today. We know far more from things like, online sentiment analysis. We know far more about what makes people emotional, yeah? What things they react to in a visceral way. Delma was just kind of shooting stuff, or literally shooting stuff into the ether. We know that so much more from today's data. When it comes to finding the facts that people care about, Delma had to do it through partisans, by opening up the letters of Nazi officials. Today, even in a country like Russia, we have non-stop leaks about the corruption of mid-level officials. We can use satellite imagery to understand, essentially, has a road been fixed in a town, and do a story about that. We have so much more data than Delma had, but do we know how to use it to give people the facts that actually matter to them? And when it comes
To give people the facts that actually matter to them?
这个知识点的含义是强调传递给人们真正重要的信息。Actually 是一个副词，表示事实或真相。Matter to them 表示这些信息对某些人来说很重要。
to fostering communities, look, there are so many digital tools that we have today that can show how a media is responsive to its audience. There's a great project called Hearken, for example, which algorithmically collects what people care about in a town or in a topic, and then gets journalists to really focus on the things that they're worried about. And there's so many digital tools that we had. So if we put these things together, the visceral emotion, the data,
Put these things together.
这个短语的意思是将多个事物结合起来，形成更强大的力量。
that tells us the facts that people really care about, the online use of communities, we can do something much more powerful than what Delma did. So, look, I know it's easy to despair. It's easy to despair when you hear people denying atrocities. It's easy to despair when we hear vast swaths of the American population living in an alternative reality. But before we give up,
Give up.
这个词组的意思是放弃或投降。比如 I'm tired, I think it's time to give up. 我累了，我觉得是时候放弃了。
surrender, I think
Before we surrender.
这个短语的意思是在我们投降之前。它强调了在某种情况下要采取行动或做出决定之前，需要考虑到的一些因素。
Surrender.
这个动词的意思是投降或放弃，它可以指在战斗中投降，也可以指放弃某种权利或机会。
we can at least take some of Delmar's lessons,
Take some of Delmar's lessons.
这个短语的意思是采取某种人的教训或经验，它强调了学习和吸收他人经验的重要性。
use them with modern technology, and really, really try to reach them. Thank you.
Really, really try to reach them.
这个短语的意思是真正努力的去接触或理解某些东西，它强调了对目标的执着和决心。恳请点赞，订阅我们的频道，一起学习演讲中的实用英语。